Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Linda Johnson LeBlanc, and I am the Marketing Director for Judson Press. Thank you for joining us for part one of our two-part webinar series, Starting a Nonprofit at Your Church. Now, before I introduce our presenter, I just want to give you a couple of quick notes about the webinar. First, if this is your first webinar, you should know that you're muted. And if you could please hold your questions until the end, we will allow time for Joy to address them. And second, we're recording this presentation, so afterward you will receive a link to the PowerPoint along with any of Joy's notes. So now I'm pleased to introduce to some and present to others our facilitator for today, Joy Shegstad. Joy has been designing and launching community ministry programs for over 25 years, including serving as the Executive Director of Community Development Nonprofits at Park Avenue United Methodist Church and Sanctuary Covenant Church in Minneapolis. She is a full-time trainer and consultant, and she works across denominations and cultures to help churches develop innovative initiatives that meet real community needs and tap into the passions and gifts of congregations. Joy is the author of 2 other books, and she's an in-demand speaker and webinar presenter with special expertise in faith-based organizations, community and youth development, early childhood education, affordable housing, services for the homeless, and the arts. And so now I'm pleased to turn over our webinar to Joy Shegstad.
Good afternoon, everybody. I need to get this set up properly so that you can see my screen. I like teaching on this because this is really an entrepreneurial step for a church to take. So typically congregations are at this point when their ministry is growing or they have some ideas for new ministry. I don't have the control yet. Hello?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have the control yet.
Okay, hold on.
But it's an entrepreneurial step for a church congregation, and I really love working with congregations on this because it's often a new step forward in ministry. It's kind of a new way of looking at the community and at yourselves and what could be possible. I find it's often a faith journey. Okay. I have to show my screen here. I'm making a big speech and then I keep interrupting it. Okay. Can you see my screen, Linda?
Yes.
And then I'll go to slideshow mode. Okay, everything look good?
Yes.
Okay, great. Like I was saying, it's kind of an entrepreneurial moment. I think it can be a stretching experience for a congregation. It can set you on a new path in ministry, explore new partnerships. So we'll talk about all of that today. This is part one. So today I'm going to talk a lot about the advantages and risks of this model, figuring out whether you're ready. I'm going to touch really lightly on the legal aspects of this and then start to talk about who's in control, for lack of a better word. And then next week we'll talk a lot about the structure and the governance model. Not next week, 2 weeks, sorry. It's October 28th. And I'll let's click through this. This is a little bit about me. So I would recommend if you're interested in this topic that you register for the 1 and 2 weeks out because it's going to contain some critical information on board structure, which is something you really want to think about and talk about before you start a nonprofit at your church. Here is my newest book. It came out about a year ago with Judson, 7 Creative Models for Community Ministry. So this is to help churches find new ways to engage with the community, and I've got highlight 7 different ways, and it's chock full of examples of how other churches have done this. So I think it's a good read, but I guess I'm biased. And then my other 2 books, Judson is gracious enough to let me put these 2 on this webinar, even though they are with another publisher. So the first one is Starting a Nonprofit at Your Church, so you can buy this in book form, and it's got a lot more details, so that's available at Roman and Littlefield, and then also winning grants to strengthen your ministry. So if you are interested in securing foundation or corporate funding for ministries at your church, it's really a step-by-step walking you through the whole process. So what we're talking about here today is creating a separate 501c3 nonprofit organization that is connected to your church congregation in some way. How it's connected is going to be part of what I flesh out starting today, but even more so in 2 weeks in part 2 when we talk about the structure. So there are a lot of options for what it looks like. But what you're doing is you're not incorporating your church as a nonprofit. It's actually like the church has a baby, at least initially. Sometimes the babies grow up, so there's more of a peer relationship. But it's giving birth to a whole new organization. And the 501c3 is the part of the internal revenue service code that addresses these kinds of nonprofit organizations. So churches use these for a lot of different purposes. You might actually have a school that is incorporated separately from the church that's a nonprofit. A youth center, so you might have after-school programming, recreational programming, arts programming for youth out of a separate organization connected to the church. Housing programs are very popular. When churches are going to set up a housing program, they'll often form a separate nonprofit, sometimes to protect the church from the liability and the potential expense that a housing program would bear. Job training is another example. And then I want to say, too, I don't know if anyone is on the line who's working in international development and missions, but we'd often see that. Some organizations opt to incorporate a nonprofit connected to their church here in the States, almost acting like a friends group or a fundraising group, oversight group to the missions that are happening in other countries. And we did do the poll at the beginning. Most of you said you have other as your area of ministry. About a quarter of you said children and youth ministry. And so maybe during the question time you can submit what kinds of ministries it is that you're working on. Daycare centers are also really common, so if your church is called to an early childhood focus, a wonderful focus. I do a lot of work with early education folks, and if you're not ready to go to kindergarten, it's really hard to make a go of it in school. And so this has become, here at least in Minnesota where I live, it's becoming a louder and louder drumbeat, and more churches are opting to get into that business. And the way that nonprofits look can really vary, like I said. So sometimes the church and the nonprofit are more like peers. You're really working together. We're friends. We're doing ministry together. We're helping each other out. Sometimes the relationship is more like parent. The church is the parent and the child is the nonprofit. So that it's, like I said before, it's actually like the church gives birth to a baby and is kind of tending this thing that might be smaller than the church. I have seen cases where small churches start nonprofits that become quite large. So this is a picture of Paul Bunyan. He was from Minnesota. Some people dispute that, but I say Minnesota. And so we have several large statues of Paul Bunyan here in Minnesota, so that's why this is funny. Anyway. But yeah, sometimes the nonprofits get bigger than the church, and that's just fine. It can lead to some tension if it's not quite what the people in the church were expecting. And some churches have neighborhood-focused nonprofits. So you might have a community development corporation connected to your church that would maybe be multi-purpose. So when I worked at Park Avenue United Methodist Church, we said that our special focus was on the central neighborhood of South Minneapolis. In particular, the part of the neighborhood that was 3 blocks in every direction from the church. So maybe that's your situation. You might be working in a particular neighborhood if you're in an urban center, or if you're working in a rural area, you might be looking at the county or your town, different geographic breakdowns. And also some churches have more than one nonprofit. This is quintuplets. It makes me feel tired just looking at the photo. But that happens too. So usually I would see this with larger churches, so congregations that might have nonprofits that might have programming that operates in a very different way. So you might have your housing programs in one nonprofit, your school, say you had a K through 12 school that was connected to the church, that might be in another nonprofit yet. So the main reason to form a nonprofit would be to realize your ministry dream. So this decision really ought to be mission driven. So that's what I mean by this. So which structure is best for your ministry overall, and which structure would help you minister to people most effectively? So your end result of your ministry needs to be the core of this discussion. So you wouldn't do it just to get money. You wouldn't do it just to build the reputation of your congregation or to placate the opinions of certain people in your congregation. Sometimes I do run into congregations that say almost essentially to me, all the other cool churches in our denomination have one of these, we want us to start one too. I think you need to make it more mission driven than that. So I'm going to walk you through the advantages of church-based nonprofits. These are all put together in detail in the Starting a Nonprofit at Your Church book. But I'll just go through them quickly here. I think it's important to form some kind of a team to really talk about this before you do it. I think it's good to have, I'll talk about this in a minute, to have staff people and lay people on the team, so there's beginning to be some support within the congregation being built up for the formation of a nonprofit. I find that you probably don't want to spring this on the congregation suddenly. So one of the definite advantages of having a church-based nonprofit is to pursue different kinds of funding. So I would say this is the major reason why churches pursue this structure. Part of the deal here is that many foundations and corporations can't or won't give directly to churches. Some have that right in their bylaws, so it's not even a negotiating point. I even find that some churches and individuals won't give directly to a church congregation either, because they may not share your theology or your particular faith view, but they might be able to get behind what you're doing in affordable housing, for example. Forming a nonprofit could also open the door to new collaborative partnerships for you. Like funders, I think many possible partners might be a little reticent to partner directly with the church. This isn't always the case, but I find it at times. So that might be true with schools, law enforcement, hospitals or clinics, neighborhood groups. Might say, we're really a non-sectarian organization, and so partnering with the church, I'm not quite sure. And I think to have the nonprofit also removes the suspicion in the conversation that you're just there to pack the pews of your church, and that you're really focused on this particular mission. You might also be able to recruit new kinds of volunteers if you have a church-based nonprofit. Corporations sometimes send out groups of employees to work on particular projects. Neighborhood organizations, service clubs like Rotary or JCs might kind of be able to see the vision a little more clearly if you've got a nonprofit. Another one is that this structure has the potential to help you avoid legal liability. I worked with 2 attorneys on the Starting a Nonprofit book. They both said you need to make a pretty clear wall of separation between the church and the nonprofit in order for this to be the case. So next time, in 2 weeks, when we talk about board models, we're really talking about a separate board for the nonprofit that really does not have reporting requirements to the church, and the church is not making decisions for the nonprofit. So when I'm talking about legal liability, but there also may be some insulation from extraordinary or unexpected costs if you have a separate nonprofit. And this would be good for ministries that have special risks. If you're working with a vulnerable population, housing is always one where there's more liability. And having a separate nonprofit creates the option for you to have a separate board of directors. So having a separate board, so I'm talking about setting up a separate board of directors from the church. We'll talk about this in detail in 2 weeks. Really would allow you the potential to recruit the kind of board members that are needed by the nonprofit. So people with particular kinds of expertise or connections, either to the community or to funding or to other nonprofits, maybe to other churches. Option number 1 on the board models is have your church board run the nonprofit also. But having the option for a separate board of directors can be really nice. I also think that this might allow you to create a culture and a workplace for the nonprofit board that is different than that of the church board. So sometimes churches will start a nonprofit so that they've got an organization that can be a little bit more nimble and responsive to community needs than maybe the church could. I don't know, maybe nothing ever gets bogged down in the committee structure at your church, but I've definitely seen that happen. And like I just said, there is the potential for when you set up a separate nonprofit, you might have the ability to make decisions more rapidly. Churches can have complex, kind of drawn-out decision-making processes. I do a lot of work with Methodist churches. And for example, if a piece of property became available in your area and you needed to act quickly, it's a little hard to do that as a Methodist because I think you need to have 2 charge conferences and a church conference, plus the trustees and your administrative board have to get involved before you can buy property. Your nonprofit, depending on how tightly it's connected to the church, might be able to respond more quickly in that situation. You might also find the need to move quickly if you've got a partnership opportunity that comes up suddenly, a funding opportunity. So if you were going to go in for a government grant, a lot of times those are like 6-week windows. And if that's something that the church board or the church needed to sign off on, you might not be able to meet the window. I think another advantage, he looks annoyed. Another advantage is that the nonprofit, you can really potentially insulate the nonprofit from the politics and personalities of the church. One of the issues might be that the annoying or difficult people follow the nonprofit, like get involved with the nonprofit also. So, if you're in a church setting where there's a small group of people that are kind of controlling or maybe negative, it might be possible to pull out a piece of your ministry and set it up in the nonprofit, have kind of a fresh life for the idea and get some other and different people engaged, including people outside of your church. And I think, too, another advantage is that you can potentially pursue more controversial ministries, something that maybe the church might want to distance itself from. So sometimes I see this with like community organizing efforts where there might be a take on City Hall kind of approach or tactics that the church congregation might be like, I'm not sure we want to affiliate with that directly, but we could be connected to a nonprofit, loosely. That would be an occasion. Another advantage is that ministries can last longer when they're institutionalized, I think. So if you set up a nonprofit to do your youth programming for the community, open a youth center, instead of being a line item in the church budget that may put it at risk when it's time to, there's a downturn in the economy and maybe it's time to cut some things that might not make it through the budgeting process, or the staffing process at the church, you'd have your own separate organization that would really be all about doing that work. I think it's harder to eliminate an entire organization than to take something out of the church budget. Now I'll talk a little bit about the risks of this model. I think a risk of starting a church-based nonprofit would be that you might lose your faith focus. An advantage of nonprofits is that they draw outside people and resources. You have to work at it, but you can draw in those outside people and resources. But if all of those groups and people are not faith-focused, the faith aspect of the nonprofit's work may be diminished. Another potential downside of this is the church may feel less ownership for the ministries that are under the nonprofit. So if the nonprofit is attracting outside funding like you want it, partners and volunteers, the church leadership and members may just say, maybe we're not needed. Somebody else is taking care of this. So overall, you may end up with less engagement by church members. I think that's not ideal. So some churches set up nonprofits to do just that, kind of keep it separate from the church and run this outside thing. I think the best model for you here is if there's some synergy between the nonprofit and the church. So the nonprofit's attracting those outside resources, but is also drawing in people from the church to volunteer and to give financially. So it's maximizing what's bigger. Another downside is that having a nonprofit costs more than not having one. So even without staff or major program costs, you're still going to have filing fees, printing of letterhead, newsletters, brochures, etc., setting up a website. Eventually you'll have staff positions. And I think there's also more administrative work with a nonprofit, especially if you have a separate board. And like I said, here it is, more administrative work. So you have all this kind of stuff you got to keep track of, communicating, paperwork, submitting funding proposals, bookkeeping and financial reports, filing with the state government and the IRS. Sometimes I work with churches, they come to my training and they go through this and they say, I think we need to not add more administrative burden here, just need to focus our resources on doing the ministry directly. And some people see, having to raise money as a real downside. So I think that fundraising is character building. It also gets you money. So it's a win-win, but some people really don't like it. And another issue is that tension could develop between the church and the nonprofit leaders. If you've got that structure separating you, there could be more room for miscommunication. Sometimes church leaders become suspicious of the nonprofit if communication is poor. The attitude is like, well, what are those people doing over there? Is their work actually helping our church? Why did they need to take this work out of the church itself? I think it's especially risky to pursue the formation of a nonprofit if you've had significant church staff or board transition. So if your senior pastor has moved on, or someone in a key ministry program position, your executive pastor maybe would be in charge of this, I would say wait to move forward. If there's been a recent breach of trust within the church, so money was taken, personnel decision got really messed up, there's a poor communication about something important, I would maybe wait for that to settle before you begin this process. And then if you've got, hopefully it's not like this in your church, but if you have significant factions or conflict in your congregation, I'd really give some serious thought to whether you want to do this or not. I've worked in some churches where there was it's conflict all the time, factions of people looking for ways to have conflict. I think it's hard to have a separate nonprofit in that environment. So you need to weigh the risks and advantages of forming a nonprofit carefully before you proceed. And then I'm going to walk you through the readiness steps. So is your congregation ready to pursue forming a separate nonprofit? I think it's good to be able to check off all the items on this list before you proceed, but you might just decide to go forward once you have most or not, but not all in place. So you need a dream that requires a nonprofit. We have a ministry dream that cannot be realized without the nonprofit. I don't think you start your nonprofit and then try to form the vision. It's the other way around. Excuse me. And I think you also need to have a ministry that extends beyond the congregation or the core ministry areas of the church. So there really wouldn't be a reason to form a nonprofit, say, around your internal children's ministry. If you wanted to do something for people outside the church, children outside the church, then you'd look at forming a nonprofit. So typically nonprofits are formed to reach outside of the church, like I said. So it's people outside the church, developing partnerships with groups outside of the church, and for ministries that are not part of the typical core. So I'd say that in a church, the core ministries are worship, pastoral care, spiritual formation, Sunday school, things like that. You're going to need to have a clear mission and vision. So you're going to need to be able to describe who will be served, what you will be doing, where it will be, and who you will be working with. And before you form your nonprofit, land that plane. As well, at the very least, you're going to need to put it down on your IRS application for 501c3 status, but you just need it to move any organization forward. You're also going to need the support of key church leaders in order to develop a nonprofit, so you've got to have the support of the senior pastor. So if you're one of those kind of renegade entrepreneurial staff members that kind of likes to go off on your own, on this one you're really going to need to get the support of other people. I think at least some of the church board or council members need to be behind it. Other key staff, including program staff members whose program areas will be affected by or represented in the work of the nonprofit. So if you want to open a community-focused youth center, you're really going to want to connect in with the youth minister at the church, for example. And then think about the people in your congregation who don't have a title but are strong leaders, strong opinion leaders in the church and have a lot of influence. So at Park Avenue, there's a guy named Ed in the congregation who was opposed to this idea, who wanted to form a separate board for the nonprofit. Park Avenue already had the nonprofit. And he just felt real leery of the structure, and so I invited him in for some conversations and wanted to show that his concerns were being dealt with, and that helped ease the process. You're going to need some funds for nonprofit startup costs, so like I said, filing fees, legal fees, program startup costs, printing, bank fees, bookkeeping, those kinds of things. And if you're not ready, what do? I think you need to hold on to your dream while you gain more support and resources. Doesn't mean that you'll never start your nonprofit. You may just need to wait a while to garner more support. And I think it's worth waiting rather than trying to take a run at this and not be successful. And I'm going to touch, here's the idea about forming a task force to review whether or not starting a nonprofit is a good idea at your church at this time. So this would be a team that forms before you decide to proceed. So this is really a task force. If you decide to go ahead, you might actually need a different group of people to help you put the pieces in place. So maybe I should explain that. But I think for this pre-task force, it would be good to have key staff and lay leaders to serve on this. I think at least some representation from the church council or church board would be essential. Probably the senior pastor. If you're in a very large church, maybe you're looking at the executive pastor or one of the pastors over the program area most affected. So I don't know, maybe it's your pastor over pastoral care if you're going to be doing some work with adults in the community, for example. Or I'm working with several churches now that have recovery ministries, addiction recovery ministries. If there's somebody that handles that on the church side, on the church staff, invite them. I really like having intergenerational teams work on things like this. I think it's good to have people of all different ages and stages at the table. I think the process would be to review the advantages and risks and how those would apply to your setting. So what would make this especially fruitful or especially difficult to pursue at your church, and really lay that out and talk it through. Because if there are risks, there may be some ways to deal with those risks, or if you think people are going to be especially challenged or threatened by the formation of the nonprofit, there might be ways to ease that for them by the way you communicate. And then the team would make a recommendation to your church board or council. I'm just going to touch really lightly on the legal process. So people often think this is all that's involved in forming a nonprofit. To me, the other pieces like strategic planning, landing on that mission and vision, and the structure piece, the connection to the church, plus forming your board of directors and getting the board engaged in appropriate ways from the get-go, are bigger pieces. I think the legal process is rather cut and dried. But even given that, I'm going to say I would recommend using an attorney to help you with this. You need an attorney that specializes in nonprofit law. I would check in your congregation for somebody like that, possibly with your denomination. Sometimes denominations have legal counsels on retainers, so you might be able to get free or less expensive help, or with law firms in your area that provide pro bono assistance. There might also be like an intermediary in your area that helps nonprofits, that has somebody on staff who would incorporate a nonprofit, work with you to incorporate a nonprofit fairly cheaply. My advice on this is to prepare for the process as much as you can. So flesh out some important aspects of the nonprofit before you begin meeting with the attorney, because as you know, they charge hourly. So you want your vision and mission in place. You want your key programs to be identified and undertaken. And then they're always going to ask you for a 3-year budget with revenue and expense projections, which is very difficult to put together when you haven't formed your organization yet. But you'll need to do it, so start thinking about it, start crafting that. And then check the availability of your nonprofit's name, including online. So you'll want to check with the Secretary of State's office in your state just to see if the name that you'd like to name the nonprofit is available. Often you can check that out online. And the rule of thumb is that, I guess the legal language is it can't be confusingly similar to the name of another nonprofit, is what they say. And then, like I said, check out domain names on the internet as well. Next step for you will be to prepare the articles of incorporation. So there's 2 steps in this process. One is that you'll be incorporating in the state where you're located. That's a fairly easy, inexpensive process. And the second step is to incorporate at the federal level, and that's when you become a tax-exempt nonprofit organization or 501c3. So to incorporate in your state, you'll need to prepare the articles of incorporation. That's something that your attorney can work with you on. But you'll need your name, the name of the nonprofit, its purpose, its address, the number, the names and addresses of the first board members, and then the name of the address or of the person or persons who will serve as the incorporator of the nonprofit. And then the bylaws. This is the place where you really need your attorney. So kinds of things that would be in your bylaws would be how many board members will you have and how long will they serve. Are there any specific requirements of board members? So for example, a lot of church-based nonprofits will say we want a certain number or certain percentage of the board members to be actual members of our church. So the bylaws is where you would spell that out. The details of how board members are elected, a committee structure for the nonprofit. My advice to new nonprofits is always don't overdo it on the committee structure. And then how the church is involved in governing the nonprofit. So does the church board, for example, get secondary approval on changing the mission or the bylaws of the nonprofit, or changes in the annual budget? So we'll talk more in 2 weeks about this how much control does the church have, how much autonomy does the nonprofit have from the church. But this is the place where you'd put that sort of detail. Then we have Form 1023. Dun dun dun. This is like the big, I don't know, last time I checked it was 40 pages long. I looked at it this summer. So this is a federal application to become a tax-exempt nonprofit. And I would recommend getting attorney's help on this one. But you can go to irs.gov and look the thing up and then familiarize yourself with what it is that you need to fill into the form, and then you can start gathering that information out. So let's start talking about who is in control of the nonprofit. And like I said, there are a number of options on this. I think some of it, depends on the ministry view of your church congregation. So, are you a congregation that kind of likes a tight ship? You like everything kind of well organized, all the ducks in a row? If people want to get engaged in ministry, they've got to be vetted, they've got to be trained. Or is this more, it's a little bit more of a looser model, more flexible? You say, hey, if you've got a ministry idea, we want to get behind you and help you with this. I mean, just think about sort of the personality of your congregation as you're thinking about sort of how much control the church wants to have over the nonprofit. So your key questions here would be, how much control will the church have over the nonprofit, and how much autonomy will the nonprofit have to do its work? These are important questions to think about before you take the leap into actually forming the organization. So who's going to make decisions about critical things like staffing, budgets, the mission of the nonprofit, the programs of the nonprofit, board issues, fundraising. And I would lay all that stuff on the table as you're working with your task force to think about the advantages and the disadvantages, and maybe even that team wants to recommend one of the board models that would be laid out that would be more appropriate for your church. So, for example, will the nonprofit have its own ability to hire its staff, or would the church want to sign off on that as well? If the nonprofit is going to head in a significantly different direction, would the church want to have some say in that? And I think as we get ready to talk about the board model, I think you need to do a couple of things here. One is to determine the level of trust in your congregation. Do people really trust the ministry staff and lay leaders? And if not, a board model where the church has more control over the nonprofit may be appropriate. Second would be to identify the management areas where the church would want more control. So there's kind of a spectrum of control that the church could have. So for example, the church might want more control in some management areas of the nonprofit, but not others. So maybe in human resources, maybe in finance. Maybe the church would want to approve the budget and the audit of the nonprofit every year, or in the hiring or firing of staff. And the third thing would be to identify the types of board members you will need in order to move the nonprofit forward. And can you find those kinds of people in your church congregation? Because if not, you might decide that you want a board model that would invite people from outside of your congregation in and onto the board. So you'd be looking at skills and connections, so skills maybe like planning, finance, fundraising, certain program expertise. So if you were going to start an early childhood program, you might look for somebody with that background. Somebody who's run a child care center before, ideally, or maybe someone who has been an early childhood teacher for a lot of years. And I also think a lot of people overlook this, but look for some expertise serving on nonprofit boards as well. There's nothing like having a seasoned nonprofit board member in the mix with you who can really help you move things forward. And I also think you're looking for connections to potential funders or to the communities that you're working to serve. So a lot of corporate foundations these days won't give unless one of their employees or one or more of their employees is involved in a significant way. So here we have General Mills headquarters. So if you have a General Mills employee on your board, you're much more likely to get a grant from the General Mills Foundation. That's an example. The other piece would be to have community representation on your board. Not all boards function like this, but I think increasingly this is becoming the way that if you were to be working with youth, for example, you'd have at least one youth member board. If you're a geographically focused community development corporation, you might have a certain requirement that a certain number of board members are actual residents of the neighborhood that you're working to serve. So think about that as well. And then the fourth thing would be to think about those denominational requirements. So some denominations require that church nonprofits be connected to the church in a particular way, or may really ask that there be more control by the key staff or church council, or approve certain decisions about the nonprofit. So buying property is one example. So I know the Methodists have really spelled out in the Book of Discipline some really specific ways that nonprofits need to be connected to churches. I know other denominations are much more congregational, so you might not even have a book like that. So I'm working with a very congregational denomination right now, and I said, well, where's your big purple book? And they said, oh, we don't have one of those. So, well, there's a little bit more about me again, so I'll tell you what we're going to talk about next time, and then I'm open for questions. So next webinar is on October 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern. You can click there to register. So then we will talk about 3 board governance models, defining the role of the board and choosing board members. establishing the vision and mission of the nonprofit, and then maintaining a positive relationship between the church and the nonprofit, which in my years of doing this I found is not that easy to pull off, so you actually have to be really intentional about it. Here are my first 2 books available at Roman and Littlefield, and the one at Judson, so you can order those. So that is the end of my formal presentation. So do sign up for part 2, and then I wanted to say too that I do consulting with church congregations that want to start nonprofits, and you can feel free to email me questions at the Yahoo address. I'm going to go backwards on this. So there's my Yahoo address. So if you've got specific questions you want to ask me, feel free to email me and I'll respond. I also wanted to say that I do consulting with church congregations. I do about 2 or 3 of these a year usually, and I love working on them. So in my consulting work I can do phone coaching. I can also come on site and meet with key people to kind of talk about structure options, the advantages and risks of this, facilitate your strategic plan and work with you on getting your budget together, and even do some preliminary fundraising documents if you want to start applying for foundation and corporate funding. So you can also email me about that, and we can talk by phone about that at no obligation to you. I just love hearing about what people are planning to do around the country in their church congregations. So it's very energizing for me to work with congregations on this. Well, I think I am open for questions now, Linda.
Okay. Joy, can you hand control back over to me?
How do I do that? I go on the panel. Change presenter?
Yes. Okay, perfect. All right. If any of the attendees have a question or a comment, you can use the raise hand feature, or you can type a question in the question box.
I would be interested in knowing what kinds of programs that you want to set up in your nonprofit, since so many people checked other on the portal.
Okay. I do have a question, Joy, and then we can come back to that one.
Yes.
There is a question: what's the most unusual nonprofit you have seen a church attempt to set up?
Yeah, that's interesting. You have to think about that. I mean, sometimes I'm totally amazed by the breadth of ministry that churches are engaged in. So they'd have like housing and healthcare and youth activities. Yeah, so I'm thinking about unusual ones. I've seen like a pet food pantry. That was kind of an unusual one. So like pet care supplies for people who couldn't afford them. Maybe some environmental things. I'm working with one right now that is a food truck church. So it's like a hybrid of a nonprofit and a church. So they have a food truck. They're parked one place now. They're going to expand the number of places where they are. And they're working with homeless people, homeless training people that prepare them and serve the food. So there's like a job skills component, and then there's an optional church service on site for people. So it's kind of a hunger, spiritual development, job skills program. So they're actually formed in the church congregation, but we probably turn off into its own nonprofit, separate from the church at some point here. So yeah.
Okay, do we have any other questions for Joy? I don't see any in the box, and I don't see any other hands raised. So would anyone like to address the question Joy put out there about the other kinds of ministry that you're looking to implement within your church setting? I believe the options that we shared were housing, healthcare, children and youth, and we know there are many other ministries out there. So if anyone would like to put that out there.
Another one is coming to mind. I just worked with a church on setting up a nonprofit to have an alternative lending institution. It's like a credit union. So they did community organizing in their neighborhood, which is really just talking to residents about what's going on. And encountered all these people that had loans with these predatory lending institutions. So like they're the storefront check cashing, payday loan groups, and just kind of dug in more. They realized that those businesses weren't really regulated, so they have a legislative piece of this. They're advocating at the legislature for more regulation, but they said, people actually do need short-term help to get to payday, and so is there a way we can offer low interest or no interest loans to people that don't involve predatory lending practices. So they're setting up an organization like that out of the process that they went through in their community.
Okay, Joy, we have another question, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to open up the line. We have a question from Jackie. Jackie?
Yes?
Hi, would you like to go ahead and put your question out there for Joy?
Well, I wanted to let you know that we have just begun a nonprofit to help other nonprofits in the community.
Good.
And the challenge for the 1023 is
Yep.
not so big a challenge anymore. IRS has posted a fabulous website, little video, how to start and stay in business as a nonprofit. I've given you the website for our new organization, Innovations for Good,
Okay.
from the United Christian Church in Levittown.
Innovations for Good. So are you doing capacity building with nonprofits?
No, actually, we're going to be helping people we're going to be working with them to empower them, so that we are the traditional thing of teaching a man to fish. So if they don't know how to do grant writing, we'll provide a workshop for them free of charge to give them some grant writing skills.
Wow, that's amazing.
We will sit by them and help them to complete the 501c3 application, which if they're doing a small organization of less than 10,000 a year, you can do online, and it costs I believe it was $400 instead of the $750.
Yep.
You can complete that in about a half an hour, and it takes about a week to get the answer back.
So less than 10K is a streamlined process.
And that's
Great.
I've learned all of that through IRS.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Good thing.
We have another question, Joy, and it is, we have a food pantry, but imagine expanding our potential nonprofit. Can Joy speak to starting a nonprofit that has a built-in flexibility to expand into other ministry areas?
Sure. I think a lot of churches have nonprofits like that. I think it's helpful if you're kind of aware generally of the ministry areas that you want to go into, so that you can include that on your IRS application. So maybe you narrow it down by your geographic area and say we're providing programs and services to the people of Hubbard County, to enhance their welfare or something. So you've got more of a general statement. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very possible to form a nonprofit that includes a lot of those different kind of programs. But if you've got an inkling that you're going to head into housing or childcare or something like that, the things that IRS I think would be sensitive about would be, is this a front for a for-profit endeavor? They're very sensitive about that. So maybe be able to answer some questions about how that's going to work, that piece of it. Um, and then I just remember when we were applying, when I was on staff at Sanctuary, we talked about doing some health, really community-based health programming, and I got asked whether we were equipped about 10 different times. So, yeah, so I mean that would be the sort of thing that an attorney could help you figure out, like, you know, if you put down that you're going to do healthcare, maybe it's going to push a button somewhere. And the thing about the IRS applications is, it sounds like there's an easy one for smaller organizations, but if you get it wrong, they will send it back to you. I mean, I think you've got 45 days to respond. And if you don't, then you just go back to zero. You got to pay your fee again and start your application over. So hopefully that answer helps.
Thank you, Joy. I don't see that anyone else has their hand up, or and yes, you did address their question. Great.
Okay, good.
All right, so I want to thank everyone, and thank you, Joy, for giving us this presentation. I encourage everyone to go out onto judsonpress.com and take a look at 7 creative models for community ministry. You can also order it online for 20% off of retail price. And we do encourage you to sign up for part 2 of this webinar that will go over the board specifics that Joy mentioned. That is being held on October 28th at the same time, 1 p.m. And I can include that when I send out the PowerPoint for this. I can include the link to part 2. We're also having another webinar titled Funding Your Community Ministry in the month of November. That is being held on the 4th, and then part 2 would be on the 11th. And I will include those as well if you haven't already registered for those. So again, thanks everyone for taking the time to join us, and we look forward to talking to you again for part 2 of this series. Enjoy the rest of your day.